Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to study a short piece of natural conversational English. So let's get started.
So in college, I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. Now, when a normal student writes a paper, they might spread the work out a little like this. So, you get started maybe a little slowly, but you get enough done in the first week that with some heavier days later on, everything gets done and things stay civil.
The speaker says, so in college, I was a government major. Let's look at major. As a noun, major means your main subject of study at university. For example, I'm an English major. I'm an English major. This means English is my main subject at university. I study English at university. You can also say, she majored in psychology. It is verb here. So, notice the difference. Major as a noun. My major is economics. My major is economics. However, major in. We have it in the sentence as well. She majored in our example. She majored in psychology. Here is a verb. Major in. I majored in economics. Let's compare the sentences again. Major as a noun. My major is economics. Here, is the verb. On the other hand, major in is the verb. I majored in economics. So, if someone asks, what was your major? You can answer, I was a history major, like our sentence, I was a government major, or I majored in history. I majored in history. Let's move on. Which means, the speaker continues, which means I had to write a lot of papers. Let me repeat. Which means I had to write a lot of papers. Which means is extremely useful in English. We use it when we want to explain the result or meaning of something. So, you either want to explain the result or the meaning of something. For example, I'm a medical student. I'm a medical student, which means I have to study a lot. Or I work from home, which means I don't have to commute. You're explaining the result or the meaning of something, which means equals to, in other words. So this means that. I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. The major required him to write many academic papers, as you can see here. But let's look at this part. I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. There is a very useful grammar structure here. Which plus verb. And this sentence, which means I had to write a lot of papers, is a relative clause. And I will teach you relative clause. What is a relative clause? A relative clause is a part of a sentence that gives us additional information about something. When you want to add additional information about something, you can use relative clause to make your sentence more advanced. Usually, it begins with words such as who, which, that, whose, where, when. For instance, I have a friend who lives in Canada. I have a friend. You want to add more information to your sentence about your friend. I have a friend who lives in Canada. The relative clause is lives in Canada. It gives us more information about my friend. I have a friend who lives in Canada. Let's start with who. I have a friend. This is a complete sentence. I have a friend. You don't need to add any more information to it. It's complete. Now I want to give you more information. You don't need to, but if you want to add more information, you can use relative clause. Who lives in Canada? My friend lives in Canada. So, who lives in Canada is an additional information which is called relative clause. We use who mainly for people. She is the teacher who helped me. He is the student who won the competition. I know a guy who speaks 5 languages. In each case, who refers to a person. Now, let's look at which. Let's talk about which. We had it there, which means. We normally use which for things and ideas. For example, I bought a new laptop which has a very powerful processor. What was a powerful processor? What has a powerful processor, pardon me? The laptop. So, which has a powerful processor is relative clause. Gives us more information about the laptop. Another example, I watched a movie which was really interesting. What was interesting? You can ask this, right? What was interesting? To find out what is the additional information and what is the main clause. What was interesting? The movie was interesting, right? So, which was really interesting is relative clause. Back to our original sentence. Now let's return to our sentence. I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. I was a government major. This is the sentence, right? I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. We have I was a government major. That's the main clause. Then, which means I had to write a lot of papers. That's the relative clause. But here is the interesting part. In this sentence, which doesn't simply refer to the government major. It refers to the whole idea before it. So we can rewrite the meaning like this. I was a government major. This means I had to write a lot of papers. Or I was a government major, and this means I had to write a lot of papers. So, which means here is a very useful way to connect an idea to its consequence. Let's compare 2 sentences here. Sentence A. I bought a laptop which is very expensive. Here which refers to the laptop. The laptop is expensive. So the meaning is I bought a laptop, sentence is finished, then the laptop is expensive. However, in sentence B, I bought a laptop, which means I have less money now. Here which refers to the whole situation. I bought a laptop, so the meaning is what? This means I have less money now. You're talking about your whole situation as a result of buying that laptop. That's an important difference. When you said I bought a laptop which is very expensive, you refer to what? The laptop itself. However, I bought a laptop which means I have less money now. It refers the result clause, the relative clause, refers to the whole idea, not just the laptop itself, the whole situation. You don't have enough money now. Why do we use a comma here? Now look at the punctuation. I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. We have a comma before which, but why? Because this is a non-defining relative clause. Keep this in mind, non-defining relative clause. The information after the comma is additional information. You can omit the relative clause and your sentence is complete as well. Your main clause is still complete. The main sentence is already complete. I was a government major. You don't need to add any specific information to it. So your main clause is what? Complete, already complete. We don't need the relative clause to identify which person or which major we're talking about. We're simply adding information. It is called non-defining relative clause. But let me explain more. Let's compare the 2 types. Defining relative clause. The student who sits next to me is from Canada. Which student? The student who sits next to me. The relative clause here identifies the student. Otherwise, you don't know which student that person is talking about. So, you need that relative clause in your sentence. It's not just an additional information. You need that part for your sentence to be complete. This is called what? Defining relative clause. It's important information, and there is no comma as well. In defining relative clause, you don't need comma. However, in non-defining relative clause, you can say, John, who sits next to me, is from Canada. You're naming the person. You and who, your listener, know who you're talking about. We already know who John is. That's the point. You don't need necessarily to mention that relative clause here, because you're talking about a person whom you and your friend or your listener already know. We already know who John is. The information who sits next to me is just extra information, so we use commas. As a result, it is called non-defining relative clause. It is not necessary in your sentence, right? Defining relative clause is necessary information. It cannot be omitted. However, non-defining relative clause is what? Additional information. You don't necessarily need to add that part to your sentence.
So in college, I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. Now, when a normal student writes a paper, they might spread the work out a little like this. So, you get started maybe a little slowly, but you get enough done in the first week that with some heavier days later on, everything gets done and things stay civil.
Okay, let's move on. More examples with which means. Now, let's practice the exact structure from our passage. I'm a teacher, which means I talk a lot. What does which refer to? The whole idea. I'm a teacher. And what does it mean? I talk a lot. Another example. I work from home, which means I don't have to commute. This means I work from home. This means I don't have to commute. The third example. She moved to New York, which means she has to find a new apartment. Again, which means connects the first idea with its result. These are called relative clause. And it is non-defining relative clause. You're adding more information. Anyway, let's move on. I had to. I had to write a lot of papers. Had to is the past form of have to. Pay attention to the pronunciation. Had to is the past form of have to. We use have to when something have to. We use have to when something is necessary or required. I have to study. This is the present form. The past form is I had to study, and the future form is I'll have to study. For example, when I was in college, I had to take a lot of exams. Notice that had to expresses necessity in the past. Then, write a lot of papers. A paper here does not mean a piece of paper. In an academic context, a paper means a written academic assignment or essay. So, it's used for the assignment. It doesn't mean a piece of paper here. Pay attention. For example, I have to write a 10-page paper. It's a 10-page assignment or essay. But in academic context, paper is used instead of essay or assignment. This is very common in university vocabulary. We have other useful expressions as well. Write a paper, submit a paper, finish a paper, work on a paper, and hand in a paper. For example, I have to finish my paper tonight. I have to finish my assignment tonight. Then we have what? Now, when a normal student writes a paper, it means assignment, they might spread their work out a little like this. When a normal student writes a paper, this is an example of the present simple. We're talking about something that generally happens. It's a general fact. For example, when people get tired, they usually take a break. It's a simple fact. When the students have exams, they often study late. So, when you're talking about something that generally happens, and you can also say it's a general fact, you can use present simple tense. And then we have they might. We're talking about a student, a normal student, but they is used here. Why is that? A normal student, they might. Notice that the student is singular, but the speaker uses they. This is called singular they. This is called what? Singular they. We commonly use they or their when we don't want to specify whether a person is male or female. You don't want to talk about their gender, right? You want to talk talk about both genders, male and females. For example, if a student has a question, they can ask me. If a student has a question, it's a singular form, right? A student, they can ask me. You don't want to specify whether a person is male or female. You can use singular they. We don't have to say he or she. We can simply say they. And then we have might. They might spread their work out a little like this. Might expresses possibility. You can use might to express possibility. It means something is possible, but we're not certain. For example, I might go to the gym tonight. That means maybe I'll go. I'm not sure. I'm not certain. Another example, she might be late. It means maybe she'll be late. Maybe she will be late. Pay attention to the examples. She might be late, simple form. Then with maybe, we use future form. Maybe she will be late. So they might spread their work out means it is possible that they distribute their work over a period of time. I mentioned the meaning of spread their work out as well. Spread your work out. What does it mean? Spread something out. Spread something out means to distribute something over a period of time or space. For example, I spread my studying out over 3 days. Let me repeat. I spread my studying out over 3 days. Instead of studying for 10 hours in one day, I study a little every day. I spread it out. Another example, don't do everything in one day. Spread the work out. So here, spread your work out a little means distribute the work over several days. This is very common and useful expression when talking about studying work or time management. Then we have, so you get started maybe a little slowly. You get started. Get started here means begin. Let's get started means let's begin. I need to get started on my homework means I need to begin my homework. So, get started sounds very natural in conversation, and you can use that in your everyday conversation as well. Maybe a little story. You get started maybe a little, slowly. The word maybe softens the statement. You start very slowly. He's not saying that. You start very slowly. He's saying maybe you start a little slowly. This sounds less direct and more conversational. Also notice a little slowly. The speaker uses a little to soften the idea. He works slowly. He works a little slowly. The second one sounds softer. When you don't want to irritate your audience or your friend or whoever it is, you can use a little. You get enough done. You get enough done. Then we have with some heavier days later on. With some heavier days later on means heavier doesn't mean physically heavier. He's talking about workload. A heavy day can mean a day when you have a lot of work or responsibilities. For example, Monday was a heavy day at work. We're not talking about heavy in terms of physical objects, right? A heavy object. No. We're talking about workload. Here, heavy day means a day when you have a lot of work or responsibilities. The opposite could be, it was a light day. I didn't have much work. And then at last we have later on. This is a useful conversational expression, later on. It means at a later time. I'll call you later on. We'll talk about that later on. Things got more difficult later on. It means at a later time. It is very common as well. Everything gets done. This is the passive voice. The active form is I get everything done, but the passive form is everything gets done. In the passive voice, we focus on the action or result rather than the person doing it. For example, students finish their papers. This is the active form. On the other hand, the papers get finished. We focus on the action or the result. Everything gets done means all the necessary work gets completed. All the necessary work gets completed. And then we have, and things stay civil. This is one of the most interesting expressions in the passage. Things stay civil. Civil here doesn't mean related to the government or a civil war. It means polite, calm, respectful, and without serious conflict. For example, even though they disagree, they try to keep things civil. This means they disagree, but they remain respectful. A very common expression, a very useful expression. Let's keep things civil. Here we have it. It means let's remain calm and respectful. Use respectful words or polite words. In this passage, the speaker is using civil humorously. He's basically saying, if I manage my work properly, everything will remain under control. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.
So in college, I was a government major, which means I had to write a lot of papers. Now, when a normal student writes a paper, they might spread the work out a little like this. So, you get started maybe a little slowly, but you get enough done in the first week that with some heavier days later on, everything gets done and things stay civil.